or an emergency which requires an evacuation, please use the west side emergency doors and the stairway next to the elevator banks. Those in the third and the fourth balconies, please use the stairway next to the elevator banks. Members will recall that in paragraph 14 of its resolution ES-11/2 of 24th March 2022, the Assembly decided, and I quote, to adjourn the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly to resume its meetings upon request from the Member States, end of quote. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of the delegation to the document A/ES-11/6, which contains a joint letter dated 5th April 2022 from the permanent representatives of Antigua and Barbuda, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Georgia, Japan, Liberia, the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and the head of delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the General Assembly, requesting the resumption of the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of the procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014, from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, document S/2014/136, to take action on the draft resolution issued as a document A/ES-11/L4. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L4.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates. Good morning, everyone. One early morning of April 1993, delegates to the United Nations had coffee, kissed their loved ones, and went to the quiet and comfortable United Nations headquarters to do business as usual. Perhaps as many of us have done this very morning. The same morning in early April 1993, Boutros Ghali sent a special rapporteur to report on extrajudicial summary arbitrary executions in Rwanda. He reported a more robust United Nations response was needed. Critically, it found that the abuses could be precursors to genocide in 1993. Unfortunately, that was largely ignored by overstretched Secretariat of the United Nations. In early April, once again in April, in 1994, in the comfort of the United Nations headquarters, the Security Council received letters in which the Rwandan Patriotic Front reminded member states that, I quote, when the institution of the United Nations was created after the Second World War, one of its fundamental objectives was to see to it that what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany would never happen again. End of quote. In 1994, Rwanda itself was a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This allowed the genocidal regime to influence other members of the Council with its view of the situation. As Russia's presence today in the Security Council allows her to spread lies almost daily. In April, again in April, this time 2006, in the docks of New York by the Hudson River, an ocean-sized, state-of-the-art liner was launched. This magnificent liner was then docked on the shores of Lake Geneva. Beautiful as it is, far from being an ocean. We named this liner the Human Rights Council. The adoption of Resolution 60/251 was a culmination of 5 months of consultations and negotiations facilitated by President of the Assembly, Jan Eliasson, and Ambassador Arias of Panama and Ambassador Kumalo of South Africa. Let me remind you the words of Mr. Jan Eliasson, the President of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly, before the adoption of the resolution. He said, and I quote, we have now reached a decisive moment, both for the promotion and protection of human rights and for effective multilateralism and the standing of the United Nations as a whole. As our leaders acknowledged in September 2005, the 3 pillars of the United Nations, development, peace and security, and human rights, are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. End of quote. Now the world has come to a crucial juncture. We witness that our liner is going through treacherous fogs towards deadly icebergs. It might seem that we should have named it the Titanic instead of the Human Rights Council. If not, we need to take an action today to save the Council from sinking. The composition of the Human Rights Council is as diverse as the world map, as this Assembly is. But this Council, unlike the Assembly, has been established for a specific purpose to promote and protect human rights around the world. And we are in a unique situation now when on the territory of another sovereign state, a member of the Human Rights Council commits horrific human rights violations and abuses that could be equated to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bucha and dozens of other Ukrainian cities and villages where thousands of peaceful residents have been killed, tortured, raped, abducted, and robbed by the Russian army serve as an example of how dramatically far the Russian Federation has gone from its initial declarations in the human rights domain. That is why this case is unique, and today's response is obvious and self-explanatory. Let me offer you another quote. Our topmost priority is to ensure all human rights and freedoms in their entirety, including political and civil rights and decent socio-economic and environmental living standards. I believe that these questions are not an internal matter of states, but rather their obligations under the UN Charter, the international covenants and conventions, We want to see this approach become a universal norm, end of quote. It is hard to believe that the above quotation belongs to the President of the Russian Federation. Another president, however, and other times. It was said by President Yeltsin in 1992 in his statement at the UN Security Council. We can only regret that the democratic aspirations of the peoples of Russia in early 90s have by Putin's regime been incrementally turned to their opposite. Aggression, hatred, and Soviet-style thinking and reflections, including in the area of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And now we hear completely different statements here in the United Nations from the Russian Federation. This week alone, we hear from the Russian ambassador that there is a warfare in Ukraine and civilians are killed in war. It's being said, as a matter of fact, this Monday, in cold blood and as an absolute normal course of action, also known as quote-unquote special operation. Shall we agree with the describing of killings as something normal? The only healthy answer should be no, in order to contribute to the maintenance of the UN's health and the health of its human rights mechanism. All of you received the Russian diplomatic note yesterday, in which our collective effort to preserve the credibility of the Human Rights Council was considered as an approach to preserve the, I quote, domination and total control in the world, end of quote, and human rights neo-colonial policy in international affairs. We have heard many times the same perverted logic of the aggressor attempting to present itself as a victim, while in fact doing exactly what it cries against in its note, killing citizens of neighboring country, trying to dominate, if it not colonize it. In reply to that, we call on Russia, when its rights of membership in the Human Rights Council are suspended, to return to responsible behavior by implementing the decisions of this Assembly and of Human Rights Council. If Russia expulses itself from the Council, it would be its own choice, and there will be no need to blame others. Suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council is not an option, but a duty. And let me quote how this duty is formulated in the operative paragraph 8 of Resolution 60/251, and I quote, "The General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights," end of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an option, it is what the resolution prescribes. We view voting to suspend a state's Human Rights Council rights as a rare and extraordinary action. However, Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security. A draft resolution on the matter under A/ES 11/L4 is a result of the collective effort of a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions. It has been co-sponsored so far by more than 50 UN member states. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Let me now once again refer to the commemoration of one of the darkest pages in recent history, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. On this day of grievances and bearing its own tragedy of thousands of Ukrainians killed by the Russian invaders, Ukraine stands together with Rwanda and calls to reaffirm our pledge to never forget and to never allow the recurrence of genocide, which was a result of the international community's indifference. To those of you who, for this or another reason, opts today to keep being a bystander, to abstain, let me quote Elie Wiesel addressing President Clinton in 1999, talking about the perils of indifference. Indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. End of quote. The genocide in Rwanda was largely due to the indifference of the world's community. When the UN did not respond to warnings in the UN Security Council and in General Assembly a year before the tragedy that we commemorate exactly on this day, on the 7th of April. Today, in the case of Ukraine, it's not even a year, because the tragedy is unfolding right now before our eyes. In a couple of minutes, you will have a chance to prove that you are not an indifferent bystander. All you need to do is to press the yes button and to save the Human Rights Council and many lives around the world and in Ukraine. On the other hand, pressing no means pulling a trigger and means a red dot on the screen. Red as the blood of the innocent lives lost. And this image of the red bloody dots on this screen will stay with you and all of us as long as memory does not fail us. Think about it. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L4. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Сейчас не время и не место для
Today is
театрального
not the
пафоса
time or
и
the place for
патетики в
theatrics
стиле представителей Украины.
these
Поэтому я
kinds of
выступлю по существу.
extremely
Рассматриваемый сегодня проект
theatrical
резолюции по факту
performances like
не
the
имеет
one
ничего
presented
общего
by
с
Ukraine.
положением в области
In
прав
fact,
человека.
the draft resolution we're considering today has no relationship to the
Я
actual
повторю
human rights situation
слова нашей ноты,
on the ground.
на
I would
которые
like to
сослался посол Кислицын.
quote our note,
То, что мы
which
видим сегодня,
which
это
the
попытка
ambassador
США
mentioned.
сохранить
What we're seeing today is an
свое
attempt by the
доминирующее
United
положение и
States to
тотальный
maintain its
контроль,
dominant position and total
продолжить
control,
линию на правозащитный
to
колониализм международных
continue
отношений.
its attempt at human rights colonialism in
Часть
international
государств уже
relations.
пребывает в статусе подчиненных.
Part of the member states are already subordinates. Those who wish to conduct an independent foreign policy is an attempt to kind of move them to the periphery of international relations. Today we're seeing how, through the efforts of a small group of states, the human rights architecture there's a crack that's appeared in that architecture, and it was decades in the making. And the Secretary General stated that the possible exclusion of Russian Federation from the Human Rights Council could be a dangerous precedent. And as practice has shown, Western approaches in dealing with acute human rights problems in certain countries have not really been successful. Not a single conflict was resolved. It was only exacerbated. In many, this was due to the use by Western countries, the use of sanctions and military intervention, whereas Russia, throughout its membership in the Commission and the Human Rights Council, has consistently defended the principle of cooperation based on mutual respect and an equal status as one of the main foundations of the human rights architecture. Our priority has always been to strengthen constructive dialogue involving all interested sides in the process of collective development and adoption of decisions in defending and promoting human rights. We reject the untruthful allegations against us based on staged events and widely circulated fakes. Mr. President, based on everything I've said, we would like to put this draft resolution to a vote and call on all those present here to really consider your decision and to vote against the attempt by Western countries and their allies to destroy the existing human rights architecture. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I will now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
The Chair, Kazakhstan closely follows the situation in Ukraine with particular concern and expresses its condolences to the families of those who were killed and wish speedy recovery for those injured during hostilities. We call on all the parties to speedily terminate hostilities and to search for compromises aimed at establishing peace. We also adhere to the position that there is no alternative to a peaceful solution on the problem based on the principles of international law and the UN Charter. Humanitarian situation in Ukraine is dire and needs constant attention, and Kazakhstan has already provided Ukraine with humanitarian aid, sending 3 planes with over 50 tons of medicine and essential goods. Regarding the draft resolution on the suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council, we would like to note the following. First of all, in our opinion, the adoption of this resolution will not contribute to the settlement of the conflict. At the moment, it is extremely important not to undermine the negotiation process. In the current situation, it is necessary for all of us to use diplomatic efforts at all international forums, including Human Rights Council, in order to find ways to resolve the problem as soon as possible. Secondly, according to the paragraph 8 of the resolution on the establishment of Human Rights Council, membership of the Council can be suspended in case of gross and systematic violation of human rights. To establish that case, we need to have results of a transparent, unbiased, and professional investigation. In this regard, we believe that the consideration of today's resolution in the General Assembly must be preceded by a comprehensive investigation of human rights violation in Ukraine, carried out under the framework of relevant international mechanisms. We believe that only after receiving concrete conclusions and reliable information, the General Assembly may consider this issue. In the light of the above mentioned, today we will have to vote against this draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente, como miembro fundador de las
Mr.
Naciones
President,
Unidas,
as a founding member of the United Nations, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is committed to the purposes and principles embodied in the Charter of our organization and to the norms of international law. We believe that the promotion and protection of human rights must be addressed in a just and constructive manner on the basis of dialogue and cooperation in accordance with the principles of impartiality, objectivity, transparency, non-selectivity, non-politicization, and non-confrontation. Human rights should not be used in order to attack sovereign states, since that undermines the universal system of human rights, which is to guarantee the universality and the enjoyment of these rights and fundamental freedoms for everyone without distinction or discrimination. A month ago in this Assembly, we insisted on the need that the United Nations have a central role in facilitating the peaceful solutions of conflicts through dialogue and political negotiation. We regret today that the road has taken of escalating tensions and that divisions have increased among members of the United Nations. That is the wrong path. We alert the world as to the real and clear danger that in this situation in the region of Eastern Europe may continue in time, creating consequences which it will take generations to overcome. We warn about the expansive effects around the world, especially affecting the living conditions of the more vulnerable groups in every country, where hundreds of millions of individuals are today suffering the consequences of the increase in the cost of food, electricity, transportation. We also warn about the start of a new arms race, which threatens to turn toward war resources which should be used for development and for fighting poverty. This is a terrible situation, but the world is facing an even greater danger. We view with alarm that there are shocks between blocs, and this will lead to a worldwide conflict between nuclear powers which will destroy mankind as we know it today. It is our obligation to reduce tensions and to strengthen all options which allow for regulating conflicts and peaceful settlements. Mr. President, unfortunately, the draft resolution presented today is an example of the politicization of human rights. The draft tries to expel from the human rights system the Russian Federation, a country which is an essential part of the solution of the crisis in the Eastern European region. Without the Russian Federation, there is no possible peace agreement in Europe. A peace without Russia is a mirage. They may think that the time has come for a definitive victory and a unipolar power. If this draft is approved, it will affect current negotiations being carried out between the parties and will push us deliberately toward a more acute phase of the conflict, which will be longer and hard to resolve. Another immediate result of adopting the resolution will be a historical break in the best instrument created to defend human rights, which is the Human Rights Council. Its credibility, its function, and its mandate will be affected. We will be creating a systemic crisis of confidence, which will affect the United Nations as the universal organization which can resolve regional and global crises and work toward peace. In view of the above, the Republic of Venezuela categorically rejects attempts to suspend the Russian Federation as an elected member of the Human Rights Council and calls on the responsible members of the international community to vote against the draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
President, my delegation expressed deep concern to current development of political situation in Ukraine. Also, we are very concerned that some countries continue to push confrontation and distrust among member states instead of giving priority to ease tension and seek political and peaceful solution to resolve current crisis in Ukraine. We reject any politically motivated initiative, lack of objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. The alleged accusation of the cruel atrocity against the civil population in Ukraine, including a relevant report and images of the civilian deaths in Bucha, have not surely verified and proved based on the real fact and objective evidence. Prior to considering the draft resolution before us, the independent investigation must be made, and for this, sufficient time and efforts are required. However, some member states are acting and moving very recklessly for their political goals by submitting such draft resolution. Such political and unilateral action do not help to solve the problem at all. We take note of the efforts of the Russian Federation to address the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. The draft resolution is nothing but another example of the product of the political confrontation aiming at tarnishing one member state at the UN stage. For this reason, my delegation against draft resolutions contain document A/ES-11/L4. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has, on a number of occasions, expressed its principled position with regard to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, including during the adoption of the two previous resolutions of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation would like to underline once again the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and for the full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. Iran remains deeply concerned about the continuous deterioration of the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, which has sparked significant alarm in the international community. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and emphasize the importance of complying with international humanitarian law by all parties. We repeat our call for unimpeded humanitarian access to all areas of the armed conflict in Ukraine. The humanitarian needs of the affected population must be addressed immediately, and the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to the people in need must be facilitated. The international community should encourage and support continued direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine until peace is restored. The Islamic Republic of Iran once again calls for de-escalation of tensions in the current conflict and an urgent and lasting solution to this crisis through dialogue. Mr. President, we consider the text of the resolution before the General Assembly contained in document L3 as politically driven, which undermines the impartiality of our organization. My government attaches great importance to the promotion and protection of human rights. However, we are against the exploitation of UN human rights machinery for political ends, which contravenes the principles of universality, non-selectivity, and objectivity in addressing human rights issues. We have always maintained that human rights should not be undermined by short-sighted political considerations. We stress that the work of the Human Rights Council should be performed in a non-confrontational and non-politicized manner, and membership in this body should not be politicized. We would like to reiterate our position on the centrality of the principles of objectivity, dialogue, and cooperation towards the protection and promotion of all human rights based on a non-selective and non-politicized approach. We are of the view that the exploitation of paragraph 8 of UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251 deepens confrontation and attenuates constructive dialogue between countries. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation will vote against the draft resolution contained in document L4. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr.
سيد
President.
الرئيس مجددا
Mr. President,
يشهد هذا
once
المنبر الدولي
again,
الهام
this important
استغلالا
international
لمسائل حقوق
forum
الإنسان
witnesses
لخدمة المصالح السياسية
the
الضيقة
exploitation
لبعض
of
الدول.
human rights in the service
وخلق حالة
of political
من الاستقطاب
interests of
والتسييس
some
لاستهداف
countries
الاتحاد الروسي
and the
بذريعة
creation of
التعامل مع
polarization
الأوضاع
and
الإنسانية
politicization
في أوكرانيا.
targeting the Russian Federation
وفدي يؤكد
on the
الحرص على
pretext of
ضمان
dealing
احترام
with
حقوق
humanitarian
الإنسان
issues in the Ukraine.
وأهمية تقديم
My
المساعدة
delegation stresses the
الإنسانية
importance of
الضرورية
guaranteeing
لجميع
and
مناطق
respecting
الأزمات.
human rights and the importance of providing
لكنه في الوقت
necessary humanitarian
يرفض أي
assistance to
تسييس
all crisis
للمسائل
areas.
الإنسانية.
Yet, at the same time,
ويشدد
we
على
reject any
أهمية
politicization
اعتماد
of
مبادئ
humanitarian
الحياد
issues
والموضوعية
and stress the importance
وعدم
of adopting the
التمييز في
principles
قضايا
of
حقوق الإنسان.
impartiality, objectivity,
سيد
and
الرئيس،
non-discrimination in human
هذا
rights
التحرك
issues.
الغربية
Mr. President, this coordinated
الاتحاد
Western
الروسي
move to denounce
لا
the Russian
علاقة له
Federation
بحقوق الإنسان في أوكرانيا
has no relation to human rights in the Ukraine or anywhere else. Rather, it is an effort by Western countries to impose their hegemony and control over the world through besieging Russia and its punishment for its independent foreign policy. When the United States of America and its allies destroyed the Syrian city of al-Raqqa and killed thousands of innocent people there, we did not see such international media and political mobilization to expose the perpetrators of human rights violations. General Assembly Resolution 60/251, establishing the Human Rights Council, stressed that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interlinked, and intertwined, and that they should be treated in a just and equitable way, on the same footing and with the same degree of concern. However, the practice that we have seen since the establishment of that council until now proves the adoption by certain Western countries of politicization, selectivity, and double standards in dealing with human rights issues. They focus on the situations of certain countries in a manner that serves their political purposes. At the same time, they disregard other situations where grave human rights violations, systemic and grave human rights violations were perpetrated in the full sound and sight of the world, and what the Palestinian people has been exposed to for decades at the hands of the Israeli occupation forces is the best proof of that. Another example is on the hypocrisy of those states is their disregard for the safety, security, and protection of civilians, including women and children in Donbass, who have been shelled and who have been attacked for years. We haven't seen such a move. At the same time, the invocation of the pretext of paragraph 8 of the resolution establishing the Human Rights Council is a major source of concern, since we have not seen any evidence to base such talk about grave violations of human rights. What is the credibility of the sources of such information? What are the impartial international mechanisms that were providing such information or proving their perpetration? The launching of accusations and the spreading of such accusations through misleading media and the photographs and videos whose sources and places are unknown, and their spreading through open sources cannot be basis for General Assembly action on the issue. As in the Syrian situation, Security Council and General Assembly meetings are always preceded with theatrical provocations, such as we witness in the Ukraine, to justify decisions planned by Western and hostile countries in the name of international legitimacy. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today involves a serious case of hostility and a clear example of the adoption of exclusion of which we have warned. The suspension of the membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council will have an adverse effect on its balance, its universality, and the effectiveness of its role. Such suspension will enhance the hegemony of a group of Western countries on this important body. They will impose their vision and their criteria for human rights, and which will be used as a tool of political pressure and the targeting of certain countries. To be more frank and transparent, we believe that such practices represent a threat to the existence of the United Nations organization itself. Therefore, and proceeding from our firm and principled position in rejecting all attempts to politicize human rights, we will vote against the resolution before us, and we urge other delegations to be aware of the dangers of embracing these efforts at confrontation, isolation, and hostility. We call for the rejection of double standards and to keep human rights issues away from all political considerations. If we want the United Nations to continue and survive, we should all say no to such resolutions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente, Cuba ha abogado y trabajado siempre.
Mr. President, Cuba has always advocated for and worked toward a human rights council capable of facing the challenges of the international community in this area. No country is exempt. We defend the objectivity, impartiality, and transparency in the work of that body. Its procedures and mechanisms should work on the basis of true information. The use of the clause on suspension of membership in the Council will not favor finding a peaceful, lasting, and negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine. It will not promote the dialogue and understanding which should be prevalent in human rights issues. Only a few days after concluding a regular session of the Human Rights Council, that body was not even given the opportunity to state its position. Mr. President, since the start of the negotiating process on the building of the new council that would follow the Human Rights Commission, Cuba opposed the clause on suspension of membership, given the serious risk that it could be used by specific countries which favor a double standard, selectivity, and politicization of human rights issues. That clause can be activated with the support of only 2/3 of those present and voting. Therefore, abstentions do not count, and there's not even a minimum established of votes required for approving suspension. To be elected a member of the Human Rights Council, a country needs to obtain as a minimum in a secret ballot the support of the majority of the members of the United Nations, that is to say, at least 97 votes. Thus, the rights of a member of the Council can be suspended by the will of a number of states lower than the number of states which granted those rights. The Russian Federation, which was elected as a member of the Human Rights Council in 2020 with 158 votes, could be suspended today by a lower number of votes. That suspension mechanism, which has no parallel in any other body of the United Nations, could be easily used selectively. It is Russia today, but tomorrow it could be any of our countries, especially nations of the South, which do not support the interests of domination and which firmly defend their independence. It was not by chance that the more enthusiastic promoters of the suspension clause, when negotiating the new Human Rights Council, were developed nations with a clear trend to accuse countries of the South, which do not follow their alleged models of democracy, while remaining silent in the case of flagrant violations in Western countries. Not everyone in this hall share our concerns about the suspension mechanism. They know that the victims of its selective use will always be others. Could this Assembly someday adopt a resolution suspending the membership of the United States in the Human Rights Council? Just to give one example, we all know that that has not happened, nor will it, despite its flagrant and massive violations of human rights as a result of invasions and wars against sovereign states, given its geopolitical interests. They have caused the deaths of hundreds of millions of civilians, which they term collateral damage. There have been millions of displaced people and destruction throughout our planet. But this Assembly has never suspended any of its rights. We also all know that the suspension clause will not be used against the state that has imposed against Cuba for over 60 years a criminal economic, trade, and financial blockade, which no doubt constitutes the longest and most flagrant and systematic violation of human rights of an entire people, and an example of genocide against a country. It is ironic to note that the country which opposed the establishment of the Human Rights Council and requested in this same hall a vote against the resolution establishing it is the same one that has conveniently now activated, as it did in 2011, one of the most controversial clauses. Mr. President, Cuba will be consistent with the reservations when in 2006 Resolution 60/251 establishing the Human Rights Council and 65/265 of 2011 on the suspension of the rights of Libya. Adoption of the draft resolution we are considering today will establish a dangerous additional precedent, especially for the South. It is not sufficient to impose resolutions against selective countries and mandates. Now they are trying to take a new step toward legitimizing selectivity and establishing a human rights council, which is increasingly at the service of a certain number of countries, as was the case with the discredited Human Rights Commission. For all of these reasons, the Cuban delegation will vote against the draft resolution contained in document L4. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, just as the rest of the international community, Senegal is profoundly concerned by the terrible cost of the war in Ukraine.